All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I see one part of the room and the other part is in the light, so I hope you're here. The title of the conference, as you may have seen in the program, might be like a tad academic, so I changed it to this. And basically the topic of the talk is about all those kind of independent smartphone repair places you may have seen in urban context. I mean, in countries like Switzerland, the term used are Dr. Smartphone, iklinik, the kings of GSM, which is a rather good one, I guess, for Belgium as well. And what I want to try to what I want to show in this conference is to investigate and tell you more about why is it interesting to look at those places when it comes to digital cultures, and why is it important also to consider repair, maintenance about technologies in the context of digital things like smartphones or laptops, and tablets, and video game consoles. So it's a rather, I mean, it might be a bit strange because it's not a topic that is often addressed in the context of like digital cultures conferences, but I try to show hopefully that this is relevant. So probably a few words about myself, just to clarify the kind of perspective that I have. So I have two hats. One hat is academic. I work at the Geneva University of Art and Design as an anthropologist of technology, which means that I'm interested basically in what people do with technology, what people, how people design those devices and how they could be used. And I've been working for 20 years on topics such as video game controllers, 8-bit reggae music, how the world is becoming more and more artificialized with technologies. That's the bestiary of the Anthropocene. And that's one part of my job. The other part of my job is working with the Near Future Laboratory, which is like a collective design fiction agency working in Europe and in the US. But I won't discuss that in this talk. My focus will be mostly based on this kind of anthropological perspective about technology. And there's an object that we all use that I've been interested in the last, well, I'd say the last 10 years or so. It's the smartphone. And I've been doing a lot of different projects about the way we human beings use the smartphone, how we experience our everyday life with this kind of object, and looking at how people talk about their smartphone, how people discuss the shortcomings of their smartphone, their problems, etc. Looking at the gestures that we adopt, the posters that we do with those digital devices. So I guess you might be familiar with this kind of examples about like the way our body is somehow reconfigured by an object like the smartphone. Looking at like strange cases like this kind of community of people playing with 3 or 4 smartphones, for instance, looking at the way it changes our body postures, etc., etc. So that's one angle, but doing this kind of project that consists in following people in their everyday life with their smartphone, there's a topic that I hadn't really anticipated, even though it's quite common and it should be quite straightforward. It's what happened with this kind of thing happen when you crack a screen, when you have a problem with the device, when the battery dies, or there's some kind of bug or virus or problem with the software. And that's not something that is commonly discussed when we talk about digital cultures. It's often discussed as a problem that we try to circumvent, or we try to remove in project. But when you look at people, when you adopt this kind of anthropological or sociological perspective, it's quite important to consider that kind of phenomenon, because it's obviously something that people talk about a lot when you spend time with them, like I did. These different projects, for instance, looking at the way people in Geneva use their phones compared to Tokyo and Los Angeles. And basically one of the parameter, one of the dimension that caught my attention, that surprised me, was the way, the phone becomes a kind of dead brick when it when it's not working. And that's something that is always intriguing because we use those devices. We've been using those devices for quite some time, and we take it somehow for granted that it works, that it's fluid. But as soon as you crack your screen or as soon as you don't have electricity, you realize that, I mean, your life is different. And I guess you may be familiar with that. So that led me to, I mean, noticing what happened when those things happen. So looking at like those places that we tend to, I mean, overlook or we tend to neglect. I don't know, I mean, if you are familiar with this kind of places, if you already went to those kind of independent repair shops, but that's something I was not really, I mean, 10 years ago, I would not consider that as part of digital cultures, digital innovation. I would consider that as something quite, I mean, quite standard that happens, that exists on the street, but it's not something that I would consider as like digital innovation. And that led me to, I mean, taking time with people to understand how the problems they encounter with their smartphone is important for them. I spent some time in those places. And I started this project. It's a project that I did with a colleague, an ice block. The name was on the first slide. It's a project that investigated for 2 years these kind of places. We conducted most of the study in Switzerland, but we also looked at different places. That one was in Marseille, this is in Los Angeles, this curious one is in Lyon in France. And I mean, this kind of preliminary research in those places was a way to consider like Swiss repair shop, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I mean, all those things could be all good and nice and funny. I mean, as you can see from the vocabulary, the way it looks, it seems a bit like, I mean, from the outside, it looks a bit strange and interesting, but not so, I mean, not so common when you look at digital cultures. But in the last, I mean, I would say in the last 6-7 years, the whole community of like designers, artists, architects, developers became more and more interested in this kind of double bind that we realize between like two trends. One trend, and I use like the World Economic Forum as an example, is the digital transition. The way, I mean, we're pushed in using digital technologies, could be for good reasons, could be for bad reasons, but there's a push to go into this direction. And at the same time, we realize that, I mean, the environment is damaged, and there's a lot of problems regarding CO2 emissions, climate change, pollution, etc. And that led to a whole discourse about things like environmental collapse, social collapse, etc., and the need to have an environmental transition. And the problem is that, like, if you take digital transition and environmental transition, it's quite complex to, I mean, to try to combine those two transitions at the same time. I mean, there's problems regarding the way the technology is produced, which is producing a massive amount of CO2. There's problems with minerals and resources and energy. And of course, that would be problematic for an environmental transition. So this kind of double bind, this kind of like problems that we have to face in the context of interaction design, in the context of software development or hardware development, isn't easy to tackle, isn't easy to address. And one way for me as a person interested in interaction design, anthropology of technology, working in a design context, one way to address that would be to look at existing, not solutions, but existing practices that try to extend the lifetime or the way technologies such as smartphones or video game consoles or computers can last longer. And that was one of the motivation to spend 2 years in those places like smartphone repair shops. And to take, like, and this might be a bit counterintuitive, but to take Switzerland as an interesting use case. And one of the reasons to do that is not just because we are in Switzerland with my colleague Anaïs, but it's because most of the work about repair is often conducted in the global south, in countries like Ghana, for instance, in South America or in India, and that's, I mean, that's okay, that's all good and nice, but it's also interesting to consider that even in wealthy countries, wealthy European countries such as Switzerland, repair culture exists and manifest themselves in a way that could be relevant to be documented. So what we did over the course of the 2 years was to start a visual ethnography of those places. The term ethnography comes from like the methods you use in anthropology, observation, interviewing people, spending time in a certain context for a certain amount of time, and understanding with people what counts for them, what is relevant, how they do certain things. And in the context of studying the repair of smartphones, the main question was how do those people repair an object they're not supposed to repair, or it might be hard to repair because it's not well documented or it's protected, and some companies prevent themselves to act. So that was the main impetus, the main motivation, and we did like visual ethnography using, like for instance, videos, using photography, using drawings. My colleague Anaïs did a lot of drawings and made comic books out of that. I'll show you that in a moment. And the point of this was, I mean, beyond understanding the way those people repair those objects, it was also to understand how they build a certain kind of knowledge and know-how doing that. And that's something that is connected to a whole, I mean, in anthropology, there's a whole set of research about amateur practices and the way non-experts or non-professionals build knowledge about certain things in everyday life. And one of the reasons we looked at the Swiss independent repair shop was that we did not want to look at people who were trained by, let's say, Samsung or Apple, because that would be like easy for them because they would have like processes to fix and repair those things. We were interested in independent repair shop because most of the time those people had to start from scratch and to build their whole know-how into repairing stuff. This, for instance, is an old guy in Geneva who documented the different ways to, well, repair iPhones and open up the iPhones. So, I mean, that's the usual thing with like this kind of research. You collect a lot of material with interviews, with observation, with drawings, with photos, with films for, I mean, 2 years plus almost a year before the project, where I was by myself preparing the first steps of the project. And what we did with this kind of material was to find a way to enter into a dialogue with the people we talked to, the repairers. And as you can imagine, if you go to a shop like this, it's not like they expect some kind of anthropologist coming to them and being, okay, I'm going to explain you how I repair my phones. No, in general, they're not necessarily interested in that. What they're afraid of is that we would be some kind of, we want to build like a new smartphone repair shop and sort of steal them their knowledge. So it was kind of tricky to find a way to dialogue with those people. And one of the way my colleague Anaïs managed to find like a proper like posture and discuss with these people was to make drawings. Most of them were not really at ease with being photographed because that would count as some kind of like observation that is probably a bit too close to their secrets. And also most of them were there without any proper like work permit or like documents like that. So it was okay to make drawings. It was a bit trickier to film them, even though we could film the shop itself. So we collected a lot of material like that, and part of the discussion with them was also to find a way to explain them the kind of like conclusions we had, and I comment some of the conclusions afterwards. But what we produced was a set of fanzines, like research fanzines like those here, and each of the issue is about a certain topic that we noticed. For instance, the tools that people use to repair phones, the gestures that they adopt, the techniques. Another one is about the imaginaries of repair cultures based on the way they present their work, or based on science fiction, or how repair and maintenance exist in the context of science fiction. So each of those issues can be seen as some kind of intermediary summary of the material we produced and collected that we could use to go back to the shop and discuss with them about like the kind of ideas or hypotheses we had about how they worked, some kind of conclusion we reached about the way they work collectively as networks. I'll get back to that in a minute. The importance, the one in color, is about the importance of having access to good quality spare parts in mostly in the south of China to repair the phone. So we use that as a way to dialogue with people in the shops, and also as a way to dialogue with design students, with developers, with people in different contexts to get their feedback about the approach, and also to consider what would be the implications of doing this kind of work in the context of interaction design, in the context of software or hardware development. And eventually we did a book. I'll show that a bit later. But my point, and I think it could be interesting for you to discover the sort of, the everyday life of those places, what happened in those places, why they are relevant, and I'll use some of the material that we produced. For instance, one thing that, it's probably something that you may have noticed, but one thing that a lot of people have in mind when we talk about smartphone repair shop is that it's mostly for cracked screens. It's when you break a screen or a button or the charging connector. But what we notice is that it's far beyond that. And you have people focused on software, on data recovery, on helping people to learn how to talk to Siri with a proper, so that Siri understand their accent, recommendation and advices about how the algorithm of Instagram or Spotify recommendation works. So there's been, a lot of surprises on our end about the way those places were not just fixing like the hard part, like the hardware part. It was also about telling people how they could use differently their phones in a way that could be probably a bit more relevant for their everyday life, and also teach them somehow in a rough way what is a device like that and how it behaves somehow. And of course it extends to much more elaborate things about data recovery and trying to save the memory and issues like that. Another thing that and it's kind of connected to the names of those places. We were fascinated by the sort of the visual metaphor and the names. Doctor smartphones, iklinik, this kind of terminology, and as you can see from this photography from a shop in Lausanne, it expresses somehow a certain viewpoint about their role. Right? Of course, it's a bit sexist. Of course, it's a bit limited in terms of the representation. But for like, you have to keep in mind that the people doing that are not necessarily like knowledgeable or aware about a lot of issues that we are interested in about inclusivity these days. But what they try to express using that kind of language, and that's also something that they highlighted in the interviews, is that their role is not just about fixing objects, it's about helping people, it's about fixing people. And that's, I'm not sure they fix people technically, but what they try to express when they mention this, or they show the reason and the motivations to use that kind of visual language, is that their aim is to just help people living a better life, and they try to help them recover their photos of a baby that was lost, or a photo of a person that died. They try to help them consider like the stress they have with this technology and give them some recommendations about using them differently. So there is this kind of like back and forth between fixing the object and trying to care for the person that comes to the shop. And it's something that is not necessarily well known and quite neglected, that we thought would be interesting to consider. Another part that I mentioned before is, how do you repair an object you're not supposed to repair, or you can repair but it's not necessarily easy? And of course, and you can see some of the drawings here of my colleague Anaïs, we were interested in the gestures, the tactics, and that's, I mean, that's something that I don't have the time to comment here. But more interestingly, what we found really fascinating is that there's really a minority of people we interviewed that has a diploma. The one on the left was like a diploma of a guy who was a technician, not specialized in smartphone, but in good old school communication system from the 70s and the 80s. But it's really a minority. The rest was more like self-made men, mostly male. There were some female, but was mostly male repairers. And those people like who are more, I mean, who built that kind of amateur, which became professional kind of perspective. What they try to show to people is that they are experts, and there's not many ways to do that if you don't have a diploma. So you have, for instance, people like this Syrian guy, Syrian immigrants living in Geneva, who, I mean, use this kind of weird object that I've shown you here to show people what's a smartphone and what happens when you like identify the different spare parts and you sort of rebuild a smartphone with without the proper layout, and use that both as a way to teach people what a smartphone is about, but also to teach them that they can do that and they can make object work with different spare parts, like use a spare part from an Android phone on an iPhone, for instance. And that's a kind of demonstration of their kind of skill sets. Likewise, the way they build their own tools, like this is a microscope that is repurposed with different spare parts from phones that is used to do some soldering under a microscope, and all those objects that they have in the shop are used to repair the phones, but also to show people that they build like some kind of tailor-made object to take care of the object the client has. And that's, I think, is important in a different sense, that when you go to an Apple store and you have a problem with the phone, the guy takes it and goes in the back of the shop and you don't necessarily know what happened. Here there's this kind of strange relationship where a lot of people go there. We also interviewed some clients, and some of the clients, they prefer to go to those shops because they can see that kind of like what happens in the here and now of the shop, and they don't see the guy taking the phone and going in the back and probably making some kind of copy or making the clients more anxious. Another point that we noticed is the way like these kind of independent shops made of 1, 2, 3, maximum 4 persons, they develop some kind of research and development activity in their daily business. As you can see from the drawing on the left, the person expressed the fact that every time there's a new smartphone model, they buy it, quite expensive, and they have to tear it down, try to understand the different parts, where is what, etc., etc. And they try to fix it, to remount it. And that's, for them, a way to build somehow an expertise on objects that are not well documented. This documentation I'll show you afterwards. It's also complemented with like this kind of, like you see, Tupperware boxes made of spare parts from old objects. So the shop that exists, the one in Geneva, Lausanne and Zurich, that exists for like 10 years. They have like a wide range of spare parts that they can show to the users, telling them, yeah, I can repair your old Nokia 3210, I can repair your old iPhone 5, but I can also repair the new one. And it's a way to communicate and build an expertise with materiality that is quite important for their business. Beyond that, we looked at the kind of documents they produce, because repairing phone it's not just about like using tools. It's also about trying to build an expertise that can last longer. And as you can see from these photos, there's plenty of notes of schematics that they find online, or they can get from a friend or a colleague, even from competitors sometimes, with annotations, with some kind of like description Here you can see like the motherboards with different kind of description. It's written in different languages. And this, for instance, was from a binder that one of the repairer had in his backpack, and he would never leave it in the shop. He would always have it with him. Like that was like he would tell us that it's his secrets. He authorized us to take that picture. Of course, I don't know. I mean, I could not do everything with that, but for him, that's his expertise and his know-how, and he became so well known in the Geneva, Lausanne area that he was labeled the master of micro soldering. And last time we saw him, he was in a hairdresser with his microscope trying to fix one of the clients' phone, working as a sort of nomadic worker. So that kind of documentation, which goes to like really like accurate kind of level of details, was also existing with using videos. For instance, here there's Solav, who's a shop owner. She has like different shops in the Lausanne area, and she's taking videos of one of the repairers so that she can build a sort of database of different kind of content that she could get back to and use to train newcomers, new repairers. So to some extent, what she's doing here is building like some kind of knowledge base that could last longer than the work of a certain technician that she worked with, and that can rebuild somehow the way the devices work. And that's one reason that we use the term counter research and development, in the sense that you have companies like in South Asia or in California doing research and developments to design those objects. And on the other side of the pond, here you have people dismantling those objects and trying to rebuild with kind of reverse engineering approach. It's not perfect, of course, but they try to rebuild the way it works so that they could help their clients. And their research and development is helping them in their daily business. Another important lessons we had is the fact that those people working in a shop by themselves, they could feel lonely, or if you talk with them, you can realize that they're just by themselves. But we noticed the way they work in regional and international networks. The local networks could be WhatsApp groups where people exchange tips and ideas about where to find a specific spare part, like a charging connector for this iPhone model or this Android model. And that can happen even between competitors, or sometimes with the local hackerspace. There are some connections like that. And interestingly, some of the shop owners, they realized that they would be better off being specialized. Like the one in the middle, he realized they would be specialized in reconditioning screens. The one I mentioned before, the nomadic worker, being the master of micro soldering. So there's this kind of like expertise that becomes gradually a bit more specialized, and that can help people on very specific things. But the most important aspects they mention is the fact that they could not work without access to proper spare parts. Having like a local shop, for instance, we noticed this guy in Geneva who has 4 shops, and he opens one in Lyon in France, where he brings in like spare parts from Shenzhen and sell them for other shops in Switzerland and in France. And that's because he has access to the spare part that he could help his clients. And that's this kind of regional connection that connects to international connections that they called the source, basically having friends and people they can trust in Wakyambe in Shenzhen, in this big kind of like shopping mall where you can find all the spare parts for smartphones. That was the most important aspect they mentioned in the way, beyond like the documentation and the repair techniques. Without access to someone they can trust here, it would be really hard to serve the clients, because the important thing is to have like proper spare parts. So what I try to express here is that next time you see like one of these local shop, it feels like a lonely guy or 2 persons by themselves, but they're connected to other people, and they're trying to do like to build that kind of expertise using this sort of counter R&D that I mentioned, but also using this kind of like connections they have with other people. And the last aspect that I think is quite, I mean, it was quite surprising for us. It was not something that we anticipated, is that those places at first we saw them as a place where you go to repair your device. But if you remember what I like presented a few minutes ago, I mentioned the fact that those people describe themselves as trying to fix people or to help people. And that's, I mean, concretely, that happens at different levels. For instance, the one on the left explains that every time there's a new customer, he tries to tell them how to better use the phone, how to charge the battery in a proper way. Some of the shop, they give flyers about environmental issues, about the fact that we need to make our phone last longer. So recommendation and advices about the durability of the object, but also about the way it is, what's like living a proper life with a device like that. And I think this is quite interesting because when you talk to repairers and you talk about their motivations, why they started doing that, most of them started because that was like a kind of business they could start easily. They knew how to fix a screen and they realized they could use that kind of skill set to develop a business. But it never really, at first they never anticipated that they could play a certain role in fighting the environmental crisis. But as over the years, talking to people, helping people about making their phone last longer, made them realize that they could be also part of that kind of, I mean, environmental transition. And it's quite interesting to see some of the shops now using that kind of like argument or that kind of mission as a way to portray their work somehow. So that's the environmental part. In the middle, you see this young lady being, I mean, there's a guy explaining what happens on the motherboard of a smartphone and receiving somehow some kind of technical knowledge that is not often, I mean, described. I mean, me personally, I'm not often, there's not many situations where someone explains to me how this works. And what we noticed in these places is some kind of unexpected role from those smartphone repair shop is a way to help people understand to build the digital literacy. Digital literacy is somehow a term that is used to describe the kind of knowledge and know-how we build using digital technologies. And some of this kind of knowledge happens when you use them for a long time. Sometimes it happens in certain families or at school, but it's not really well shared in the population. And what we noticed is that those smartphone independent shop also help people to build some kind of digital literacy about what's a software, what are hardware issues, what are common problems you have with technologies. And also the example on the right, we saw people showing up with requests that had nothing to do with problems with smartphones. Like, for instance, there is this Eritrean lady who needs to take an appointment to the doctor in Germany. In order to do that, she needed to go on a certain website. She has no clue about how to use that website. What does she do? She goes to the smartphone repair shop. We saw a guy who had to do his taxes, had no clue about how to do that, goes to the smartphone repair shop. So that's a bit strange. But if you consider the person who goes to those shops with those requests, it's basically because they, I mean, in their mind, their mental representations about doing the taxes, taking like an appointment to the doctor, using digital technologies, it's about the digital. And for them, the only way they could find someone to help them would be to go to that kind of place. And it's somehow similar to what happened in the 80s, in the 90s, where we had like photocopy shops where people who could not write, they would go there and ask for a public writer to write them letters. The photocopy shop were not describing themselves as experts, as the smartphone repair shops are not. I mean, they don't describe themselves as experts of taking an appointment to the doctor on the digital platform. But I mean, as they can help people, why not? I mean, it would be useful to build a relationship for people, so they do that sometimes for free. And that's how we noticed how those places can act as some kind of social hub, helping people who are not necessarily like knowledgeable about digital technologies, about environmental issues, about like issues regarding how you use digital technology in everyday life, how those people could be helped and find help in those places that are, I mean, somehow neglected. So if I had to, I mean, summarize the talk in two takeaways, one takeaway is the fact that smartphone repair shops could be seen somehow as an alternative figure to the maker movement we heard a lot in the last 15 years or so. Makers, hackers, people trying to repurpose technologies and trying to build their own amateur perspective and become professional in their own way. That's, I mean, that's super interesting, and that happened in hackerspaces, in Fab Lab. But somehow the promise that some public institution put in those places, like hackerspaces or Fab Labs, in the last 10 years, helping people to extend the life of their object, I mean, showing people what digital technologies could be used. I mean, somehow those promises that were put in hackerspace and Fab Labs also existed in places that were often neglected, like smartphone repair shop. So that's why we describe them, and I'm back to the title of the talk, which is a bit academic, but we describe them as hidden laboratories of care. They're hidden in the sense that they're hidden in plain sight. You can see them on the street, but if you don't have a problem with your phone, you don't go there, you don't notice them. But if you go there and you realize, like as we did, this kind of observation and interviews with them, you understand this kind of counter research and development that is super interesting in a world in which you have a huge asymmetry between the companies, the manufacturers of digital technologies, and people on the other end, us, or those repairers who tries to, I mean, rebuild some kind of understanding of how those things work. So that's important. And the second takeaway that is important is the fact that this kind of research also forces us to shift our perspective from innovation, understood as producing something new that is spread in the population, to innovation that should be maintained or not maintained, and maintained in certain ways. Most of the time when you produce a new kind of software or a new kind of hardware, the hard part is what happens afterwards, when you have to maintain the software, when you have to maintain the hardware, when you have to make it last a certain amount of time. I mean, a brief, for instance, saying, okay, you have to design a phone and an operating system that would last for 20 years. That's really hard. You need to consider all those things. And studying, understanding, grasping what happens in the smartphone repair shop is somehow a way to understand how there are some actors of maintenance that we tend to invisibilize or forget that we should consider, and maybe in the context of like working as I do in a design school and working with designers or engineers, I think it's important to bring this back, this kind of like facts and stories, to make them consider what happens when an object is, I mean, is spread in the population and there are people trying to repair them and maintain them. So I'm reaching the end of the talk here. All those like things that I've presented is discussed in this book. That is, the PDF is for free. It's funded by the Swiss National Research Fund, so it's public money, and I'll give you the URL in a moment. And the book is both, I mean, it's both an academic book, but it's also some kind of illustration of those doctor smartphones that we tend to neglect. It's a series of 16 portraits of smartphone repairers described with art perspective, short paragraph when we discover the place, photography, then the person working in these shops explaining us how they turn from basketball trainers or coach to becoming one of the leading experts of smartphone repair, for instance, in Geneva and Lyon in France. And then it's illustrated by the ethnographic vignettes by my colleague Anaïs Bloch that, I mean, describe somehow some of the cases that I've presented. And of course, there's the academic part at the end with analysis, but the point of this kind of book is that it's I mean, it could be shared not just with like academic colleagues, but also with designers, design students, engineers, some repairers, some phone manufacturers. Like if you go to Fairphone, they're super into that kind of a book, I hope. And that's, I mean, for us, this is a way to open up a kind of dialogue about the importance of maintenance, but not taking that as a big slogan, you have to maintain stuff, but starting from the everyday life of those places and the richness of those places to consider, I mean, why it's important. So if you're interested in that, there's the URL here and there's a blog about it. And thank you very much for your attention.